This is the Why We Write session. I have a terrific panel. Before I say anything, though, I have to give you the all-important continuing education announcement. Please let attendees know that this session has been approved for 1.25 AIA and 1.25 AICP continuing education credits. For AIA, please have attendees sign in at the back of the room. Remind them to write their names and AIA numbers clearly. For AICP, attendees report attendance online at planning.org/CM. They can search event number 19209 for a list of all sessions and tours from CNU 20. Okay, this is a moderated panel. We don't have a lot of slides, but we will have a few by Peter Katz. I'm going to introduce the panel. We'll have some discussion about writing in all its various forms, and then we'll save some time to get some questions from you. And I'm assuming there's probably aspiring writers and probably very accomplished writers in the audience. So we'll get started.
Okay. Oh, not yet. Oh, I'm sorry.
And I'm to remind the panelists, when you speak in these microphones, you have to be right on top of them. Our panelists include Peter Katz, over here to the left of the podium. Peter is the author of the original New Urbanism book, The New Urbanism. Today he's going by consultant, but he's also the very first executive director of the CNU. And you may have seen recently to the right on this slide on better cities and towns, he's had a couple of really interesting essays on the early days of the movement, which are very much worth reading, along with one on Hope 6 that was recently done. To my far right is Phil Langdon. Phil is the senior editor of Better Cities and Towns, formerly New Urban News. He's also the author of many books, many articles, but one in particular from the very early days of the New Urbanism movement was this one, A Better Place to Live, Reshaping the American Suburb. To my immediate right, James Howard Kunstler, author. This is a snapshot of his books that are on sale out in the bookstore area here. He also has a web presence as well. To Peter Katz left, at the my far left, is Chuck Marohn, who's the executive director of Strong Towns. Chuck brings a different perspective on writing and on the Strong Towns website and blog. And then this is me. I'm Chuck Bohl. I'm from the University of Miami School of Architecture. Probably my better known book within this crowd is the placemaking book on town centers and main streets, and there's some other stuff here. So we're going to start off the panel. I'd like to ask Peter Katz to tell us a little bit about why he wrote the original The New Urbanism book and get us started. Peter?
Do you want to come up here?
Can
actually, if they could just switch over to my computer.
Okay.
And I'll work from here. Keeps it more.
That's your advanced button.
No, I've got my own.
Oh, he's got
my own.
Okay.
Hi, folks. The book I wrote is called The New Urbanism, and part of my agreement to do this talk was that I would be able to get the slide up for at least 3 minutes, which is good because if you wanted to buy the book, you can't, since the bookseller ran out. They only brought 3 copies. So I'm going to hope that your intense interest in the subject will cause you to order one on Amazon, because at the moment it's the only thing that's supporting me. I'm supposed to laugh at that. Anyway, I never really thought seriously about writing a book until I had something to say. And that's really important. You know, when you get a bee in your bonnet and you really have to say something, that's when you write books, which is not a reason for doing it. Once I did start writing the book, the rest of the process seemed to fall together in a kind of a almost magical way. It seemed like there was a bit of a force propelling the book along. And I don't mean to be getting all cosmic about it, but what happens is when there are enough different people who have enough things to gain out of the process, it's a little bit like when you're buying your first house. You can't believe that somebody would actually loan that large amount of money to somebody, who might be at the time, 23 years old or something like that, but the realtor, the loan agent, all these people want this thing to happen. They want you to close on the house. It's a little like the book. There were enough different people in the case of my book who had a vested interest in this thing getting out that eventually it did happen. And it happened in spite of some amazing obstacles. I mean, every time I turn around, I discovered that we misestimated the amount of color in the book by a factor of 10 or something like that. And I needed to figure out where we were going to come up with another $10,000 or $15,000, which at the time was pretty enormous. Or one of my contributors suddenly decided that they're pulling out of the book because they can't abide by the fact that another contributor got 3 more pages than they did. Or lots and lots of different things happen that I would best call near-death experiences that the book always seemed to survive. And eventually it got out. The thing about a project like this is if you don't get to the finish line, nothing happens. It's no good. You're just sort of dismissed as a BSer. But when the book comes out and it starts to work its magic, if it is a book that's about a movement or about social change or about something such as these books often are, they can be very powerful things. Now, it's important to mention my background is graphic design. I am not a writer. In fact, I was scared to death of the writing part of my book. So what I did was I designed the book first, and I made sure that it looked good, and the hope was that if it looked really great, nobody would notice the fact that it wasn't written terribly well. Now, I did put a lot of time and effort into the writing because I was worried that somebody might actually read it. So eventually, I worked through the process, and I actually had a wonderful, I'd call her a writing coach, a woman named Nancy Bruning, who was really great. She did the thing that old-time editors used to do. When you read about famous authors like Hemingway and such, they all had an editor somewhere in a cramped little office back at Knopf for one of those legendary publishing houses in New York who actually cared about the book from more than a business standpoint. They actually would talk to the author about, well, what are you trying to say here, Ernest? What's the point you're trying to get across? And they really would get into the art of what's being written. And I'm told that that doesn't really exist much anymore. The editors we now have are really primarily business people. But at any rate, I did eventually write the book. Eventually I got into the hang of writing, and I like to think that I'm starting to get actually kind of good at it. But the thing also to remember to take comfort in is the fact that most people really don't read books. The actual readership percentages are typically under about 10%. They buy them, which is important, which was important back in the age when we had real paper books. But that a lot of them just go home and sit on the shelf, which is okay. Because eventually somebody, the right people read them. So a lot of times people come up to me and they'll apologize for the fact that they haven't read my book, and I say, it's okay, my book was written for the non-reader. And again, my book is a series of case studies, and a lot of times people end up copying the case studies because it relates to a project they're trying to push through their local government. And there's so much, if you were to actually read my book from end to end, there's a tremendous amount of repetition of, say, the term, pedestrian-oriented, transit-friendly. It pops up in every second chapter. They really were meant to be standalones. My book was also consciously created as a propaganda piece for the new urbanism movement. I had been working with the leaders of the movement. I had met with them at the Lotus Club, as I described in one of those articles, to talk about a series of congresses. And I really felt that by putting this movement between two covers, that it would have a power that it didn't have as a bunch of architects doing a project here and a project there. At the time, there was barely enough built work to really tell the story. I mean, some of the photographs of Kentlands in my book, if you had moved the camera just 1 inch to the right, you would have seen a massive construction site. I was really trying to portray this thing as more than it was in the hopes that people would love what they saw and go out and build a community like this in their own region. And to some extent that happened. The essays in the front of my book by Dwani and Plater-Zyberk, by Peter Calthorpe, by Steph Polyzoides, and Liz Moule were really gifts. I was not planning on those happening. It came out of our conversations about the Congress, and they decided that they wanted to use my book as a vehicle to get the message out. And they were difficult contributors. After 20 years, I can say that. The book probably would have taken a year less, maybe a year and a half, if I hadn't had those pesky individuals to deal with. But guess what? It wouldn't have been the book it was, because their involvement really constituted a kind of an endorsement. It really was a kind of a group effort. I was doing something for them, and they were doing something very important for me. When you write books, you don't write them to write a book. You either write them to build a career or to do something like launch a movement. I've made very little money off my book, but what it did do for me was launched a career of sorts. I guess over the last 15 years I've been a sort of a new urbanist pundit, and unlike folks like Dwani and Calthorpe, who actually had urban design work back at their offices to help pay the bills, for me this was my primary business. For a time I was a CNU director for a few years in the early Congresses, but for a good long time I was just doing a mix of consulting that wasn't specifically the design of the communities. I do that now, however. So again, I believe, particularly in this age, you really need a larger strategy. What a book can do is drive people to a website, and a website can drive people to a consulting firm or to a membership organization or to any number of different business schemes. You're going to hear about my colleague to the left, Charles Marohn's very successful website. But I mean, it really, even though we all have fantasies of producing this great object to sit on a shelf, at the end of the day, you don't get paid enough in the writing of a book to not have it be some part of some larger strategy to fuel some larger enterprise. And later on I'm going to show some examples of some of the many books where I've designed the front cover of and done an outline of, but at the end of the day, I have not, knowing how much work is involved in the book I did do, I have not had the guts to move forward on a second book project unless I had a really clear idea of the business strategy. So with that, I'm going to relinquish the mic. And
great. Good start. And what year was the New Urbanism published?
I think 93.
93,
it
very
came
early.
Out, the first Congress, which I think was September of 93, I had the first bound, hand-sewn copy of the book, which was handed around, and then about 2 months later on Christmas time, they started appearing in stores.
And you'd never published a book before?
Never done one. And by the way, I designed, well, I think I mentioned, yeah, I never published one before, and again, it's been 20 years now.
And so how did you find the publisher and do the book contract?
Well, you know, I had a fancy literary agent, a big name named Morton Janklow.
You cheated.
Did all the, but ironically, I found the publisher myself, a guy named Joel Stein at McGraw-Hill, and the literary agent thought there was so little money in my book that they ended up releasing me from the contract. I paid a local lawyer in the Bay Area to help me negotiate, and I just kind of went down the road. And Janklow would have made enough money. I mean, my book sold quite well.
So you got, did you get an advance? Did you get royalties? What did you do in the contract?
I got a lousy, I had about $20,000 worth of color separations that I had to pay for out of my own pocket.
Wow.
The advance was just a little more than that. I had to pay some, Vincent Scully got a nice check. Again, it's not a money-making proposition. I had 2 cars that I had to sell during the process and roll the profits into it. I was kind of like a heroin addict who was sort of anything for the next fix. I would have sold my children if I'd had them at the time. Because you just, if you don't get to the finish line, just throw it all away.
Could you switch the slide back, please, the slides, to the other PowerPoint? I'd like to ask Phil Langdon. Phil, what year was A Better Place to Live? What was the
1994.
Okay, so another really early book. And tell us a little bit about why you did this, how this came about.
Well, I worked for newspapers before I moved on to writing in other ways. And I worked for the Buffalo News from 1973 to 82. And I used to write a lot about historic preservation and neighborhood preservation, which were really driving interests of mine. And there was, back in the late 70s, I went back to the city conferences. So I was very interested in urban places. But then I left the Buffalo News, wrote a book, and then I started writing pieces for the Atlantic Monthly. And the editor at the Atlantic, Bill Whitworth, was very interested in house subjects and houses. He lived in a suburban house he didn't like very much, and So he had a journalist to go research topics for him, and he figured people are just inherently interested in houses. So I did a cover piece for the Atlantic Monthly in 1984 called The American House, What We're Building and Buying in the 80s. And then having done that, then I got a letter in the mail from Andy Stewart, head of Stewart, Tabori and Chang Publishers in New York, who at that time was married to Martha Stewart. So I actually got a lunch served by Martha when I went to negotiate my contract poorly. But in any event, Andy Stewart said, well, why don't you do a book on, expand your Atlantic piece into a book on houses? And so I decided, well, yeah, I'd love to do that. And I'd like to travel, which I didn't get to do much as a newspaper man. So I went all around the country on one-week trips to different regions. And toward the end of working on that book on houses, which was just kind of a survey of what was being built, energy efficiency, solar, construction, siting, also, amenities, I came across Charleston Place, which was one of Dwani Platter-Zyberg's very early suburban projects in Boca del Mar, in Palm Beach County. And I really thought, wow, this place is really charming. It really has a nice scale with narrow streets with the houses, you know, sort of creating the sense of an outdoor room. And I arrived at this place after stopping at some other subdivision that was lifeless across the street. And I went to Charleston Place, and all these people out walking around, and I see somebody's out there barbecuing in front of his house instead of in his backyard. And I thought, well, that's kind of curious. And I realized, well, it's probably because out front is where you really see people, and it's a lot more fun being there. So anyway, so I ended up talking with Dwani and learned of Seaside. And I hadn't seen Seaside. So in any event, I ended up from that getting the idea to, a couple of years later, to do a piece for the Atlantic called A Good Place to Live, which was basically the idea of the rediscovery of the 19th century town, the small town, and trying to take the characteristics that made towns sociable and interesting and sometimes aesthetically appealing places and apply that to new developments. So then I went to Seaside and wrote this piece. And then having done, so I did this piece for the Atlantic that was about, I don't know, about 13,000 words. I also had Battery Park City in toward the end of that article. And then I thought, I would really like to write a whole book on this topic, and I'd really like to see a lot more of these places, because Dwani was telling me about John Nolan and some of the early pioneers from the early 20th century. So I lined up some grant money from the Graham Foundation and from the National Endowment for the Arts, and went out and traveled all over the country to see all sorts of places, new and old, and learned a lot about those, and then decided that really what I wanted to do was a book on suburbs, because it just seemed that suburbs were what the new urbanists, or neo-traditionalists as they were then known, were really focusing primarily on. And we're doing some interesting work trying to improve. And so to do a book on suburbs, I felt that, well, I could throw into this stuff from all the kinds of places that I liked. For instance, in Buffalo, I lived on a street between Delaware Avenue and Elmwood Avenue, where in a very part of town that people like to live in. That had lots of two-family houses, and the owners lived on the first floor, tenants on the second floor. You had one and two-story front porches. You could go from an Olmsted Parkway Boulevard down at one end of the street. At the other end was Elmwood Avenue with all sorts of shops and restaurants and cafes. So anyway, so I took ideas from suburbs, small towns, urban neighborhoods, and put them all into this book, and tried to tell about the ideas that people were exploring, the kinds of places they were trying to build. And so the book finally came out. It took a long time for me to get it done. In the meantime, I had signed a contract to work on a couple of books for This Old House, on kitchens and bathrooms. I was a freelancer, and you take what projects come your way. So anyway, the book came out in '94. I'd hoped that it would get picked up by a commercial publisher and sell really well. It turned out that commercial publishers were interested, but they didn't see big sales coming from this, and I ended up going with the University of Massachusetts Press, which I liked a lot. They did a very nice job with the layout, and university presses keep books in print forever, unlike commercial houses. And when I signed up with UMass Press, found for me by an agent, they said, well, we'll bring it out in hardcover, and maybe a commercial house will pick it up and bring it out in paperback, which was what happened a year later. HarperCollins brought it out in paperback, sent me on a one-week book tour, and they kept it in print for about 2 years, and then the rights reverted to UMass Press, and UMass Press brought out their own paperback version, and 18 years later it's still in print. So, I didn't make a lot of money on it. Some of my projects have been kind of a mix of, getting grant money, doing magazine pieces, and doing books, and between the various sources, I can live okay, but it's not lucrative. And I had a lot of fun. I really enjoyed working on this and being able to go out and travel the country and see lots of places, and tell people why I thought they should be thinking about living in places that are more compact, more walkable, have a mix of uses, and that feel much more like complete places as opposed to the kind of blown apart suburbs that we've produced, since the Second World War. So it took me a long time, but it was very satisfying.
And unlike Peter, your profession is writing.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Jim, take us back to the beginning, because you've written so much in many different genres, obviously, but the Geography of Nowhere, when was the Geography of Nowhere first published?
That same year, 1993, which was a kind of a seminal year for all of these things, including the formation of the Congress for the New Urbanism, so that you could see that there was a kind of a meme loose in society that was pulling a lot of things together in a synergistic way. Shall I just go on?
Go on.
Well,
go on.
I had the good luck, or maybe the misfortune, to spend part of my childhood in a classic Long Island suburb, 3 years, up until I was 8 years old. And then I moved to the east side of Manhattan, where I mainly grew up, so I experienced that. And then I went to college in a little provincial Main Street town in upstate New York. So I had an idea of sort of the different dispositions of things in the USA. And I had an abiding feeling of being in places that made me uncomfortable almost all my life in one way or another. By and by, I got out of college, and I went into the newspaper racket. And I was a young reporter when the first oil embargo of the 1970s happened. And it made a very strong impression on me, because you could see how fragile our society and our economy really was. It kind of removed the mask or the curtain from behind the workings of our economy and our society, and you could really see what kind of trouble it was liable to get into if we continued to make these decisions. It was around that time I also developed the theory that life is tragic, and history doesn't care if your society makes really bad decisions. So there was a rather strong tragic element to the whole thing. And by, I got another job. I worked for Rolling Stone magazine in San Francisco, and I thought I'd gone about as far as I was going to get being a salary mule, and I dropped out with the deliberate intention to write novels, because that was the programming for young writers back in the 70s, if you were ambitious. So I moved to a little town in upstate New York, and I cranked out about 8 novels, and they all got published by mainstream publishers, and I was still waiting on tables after the 8th book came out. That was, I was getting some kind of a message about what I was doing. And just out of the blue one day, I got a call from the New York Times Magazine. I'm not quite sure why they asked me to do this, but they sent me off on a bunch of assignments to write about the general subject of the perceived overdevelopment of America. Because, you know, we were now in this situation in the United States where everything that was new, that was built, was driving people crazy, making them unhappy, ruining their lives, ruining their neighborhoods, ruining their towns. And people were starting to sort of pay attention to this. And they wanted to figure it out. And it actually turned out to be a rather complicated thing. So I wrote a series of stories about this for the New York Times, Sunday magazine. And then I undertook to write one that was going to sort of sum it all up. And the working title was, Why is America So Fucking Ugly? Because the idea was that what was wrong with it was that it was just visually unattractive, which was not true at all. But that was sort of my idea, and I was hard, like a lot of people, for me to get past that, to really see what was under the hood of this problem. And so I wrote this, this final summation article, and they killed the story. And so I took the story and turned it into a book proposal, which my agent turned around and promptly sold to Simon & Schuster. So then I got a book contract, and I spent 3 years writing the geography of nowhere, and I wasted a lot of time talking to a lot of the wrong people. I was going around talking to people like Michael Graves and Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, and all these people who were basically who had gone into the track of trying to mystify the public. That's been the whole racket with you know, the Starkitecture business for the last 30 years. It's all about mystifying the public so that you, the Starkitect, can appear to be a supernatural genius. And so I went to talk to all the supernatural geniuses about why America was so terrible, and people like Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown were saying, oh no, there's nothing wrong with it, it's great. You know, we love it. It's so ironic. And in fact, Denise Scott Brown threw me out of the office because, you know, I kept on making this point that, you know, there's something wrong with this. Oh no, it's fabulous. Anyway, so I went through this whole process, and I began to sort of get clued into a few things, and then I stumbled upon Andres Duany, and we had a few fruitful conversations, and that put me on the right track with a whole bunch of people. I talked to Peter Calthorpe and Doug Kelbaugh and a bunch of other people, and I began to understand what this particular group of young, then still youngish boomers had accomplished. And what they had accomplished really, you know, after the traumas of the 70s was that, and after they got over trying to become solar technologists, you know, they began to understand too, it wasn't just about building green buildings or solar buildings or, you know, passive buildings that would heat themselves. It was about the ensemble of buildings and how they were assembled into some kind of a meaningful human habitat. And they had a very firm idea about what this was by the time I ran into them. And they informed me. And I became a kind of a publicist for the movement, which I thought was extremely important because I thought that suburbia was a bad enough problem in the United States that it could probably destroy us economically and socially and politically. That it was an environmental fiasco and a spiritual problem and an economic disaster, and it had so many dimensions to it. And it was also the end product of a set of tragic choices that we'd made as a society. And finally, because I understood from a very early age that I was a polemical writer. I was a certain species of writer. I really wanted to punish the some bitches who made me live in this. So I undertook to mock and ridicule them as much as possible and hurt their feelings and make them ashamed of what they were doing. And then I wrote 2 more books about it. to take it even deeper into the realm of shame and humiliation and mockery and ridicule. And that's what I did.
So that's.
I do want to add, I did not get rich doing it.
And so it's important to know and to discover kind of what kind of writer you are. So that's a good point. And also, it's good you're hearing kind of also the business story or how the book, really became a book and became published along the way. I'm going to round out the print people, the archaic writers of books, and then we'll move on to the modern world of writing. The placemaking book. And as Peter Katz was saying, you either have something you really want to say, or maybe there's a business model. And I did not have a business model in mind. I had something I really wanted to study. I'd had a short career as a planner and realized that my planning education didn't really teach me anything about physical planning, and so I went back for my doctorate. So my path to writing this book was I needed funding to do my research. I'd already decided my research topic was on new urbanist town centers, and I'd written several proposals to the usual suspects to try to get enough money to go out in the world and do a bit of research and actually publish a dissertation, all of which got denied. And in terms of building an academic career, it was also kind of crazy because my professors all said, whatever you do, don't tell people you're studying new urbanism, because you won't have a future in this business. But it was for me, it was a mission, it was a calling, it was something I really wanted to do. And then the Urban Land Institute was starting to hold these conferences called placemaking. This was their brand for the conference, placemaking. I probably would have called it something dumb like town center development and design something. But they had already had a conference they called placemaking. I was writing book reviews while I was a doctoral student for Urban Land magazine, just to make a few bucks while I was in school. I knew the book review editor. I said, hey, they're holding these conferences. It's all the projects I want to study. Can you get me in to write about it or to go? And so he did. He hooked me up with the ULI. I was going to go cover one of the conferences and write it up for the magazine. I was going to make a little money. I'd get to meet people and see the projects presented. And then that fell through at the last minute because somebody else was promised that gig. So I was really bummed. I was a starving doctoral student, didn't have any research money, but they remembered me through that conversation that this guy in Chapel Hill was studying these places. And then they came back to me and asked me, would you like to write a book about this? And I was like, yeah, sure, I'd love to. And then they said, okay, send us a book proposal. I had no idea how to write a book proposal, so my route then became I started calling the people who had written books for ULI. So I talked to Doug Porter, I talked to Reed Ewing, I talked to a few other people. And so, if you're finding yourself in this situation, the best thing to do is to talk to people who've done it and who've done it for that publisher. Because the Urban Land Institute was very different from these other publishers. They're a trade publisher. They have their own book series they publish. It's a very different business model, and one of the nice things about it is it has all its own built-in marketing. It has its own built-in audience and apparatus, so I didn't have to invent the machine, but I did have to understand how do I put together a book proposal so that they might accept it. And the best advice to me was, look, you can estimate your hours and how long it'll take you and everything, but you're never going to get paid back for the amount of time you put into this. You do it for other reasons. You do it to, help launch your career and for other reasons. So I took that advice. I did my estimate. I added money for travel. I never thought they would accept the number that I made up and picked out of the air because I literally just made it up. And they said, sure, okay, when can you get started? And we had a wonderful Thanksgiving dinner that year with my family, and actually, bought a big turkey. But it was a big celebration because I finally had money to go out and visit these places to do the research. Now, the end of the story is that does not constitute a dissertation, so I had to write another 400-page tome that had to satisfy my dissertation committee. But it was great. I finally could go out in the world. I could research the places. The genesis of the book, and this book also is not on sale out in the new urbanism area. This book is in its 5th printing for ULI. Other than their textbooks, it's been one of the best-selling for a while. It was the best-selling book, but it's been one of the best-selling books. And my approach was, there's a lot of books that do case studies, and the ULI kind of format was a case study book. I was interested in something that would have more shelf life, that would last longer. So I added chapters in the beginning on history and precedent. I added a chapter on timeless design principles. I added a chapter at the end, a compendium of planning ideas, design ideas about town centers. And I think that's what's made it stand up over time, because the cases get dated, and in fact there's probably much better cases now, but they were put in the context of this larger topic, and so I think that's what sustained it over time. And it did send me off in a totally different direction, which involved lots of travel and speaking and everything. So it became that, but that was not what I set out to do. So we've covered the print stuff. Let's move into the modern realm and hear from Chuck Marohn.
Sure, thank you. I don't have a long story about the path that brought me to writing a book or being published or discovered or what have you. I kind of woke up one day and said, I have something important to say. I'm going to start writing, and I think I'll probably continue to do it until I don't have anything important to say anymore. Back in the early 2000s, I was just out of graduate school, and I was working as a private consultant for my own planning firm, doing planning and engineering work in small towns in central Minnesota. And I liked to write, so I would write, they weren't letters to the editor because they ran in the column section, but I would write these kind of observations that were meant to be professional observations of a, kind of critical but delicate, I tried to be delicate in how I wrote this stuff, and would submit them to the local papers. And I knew I was actually played in a band with the editor of one of the papers, so he kept kind of asking me to contribute. And the cities I worked for hated it. And the Rotary Club people would call me up and say, this isn't a great way to build a business, Chuck. You should be writing happy stuff. And after, a little while of doing this, I just quit. And I think one of the professional regrets I have is that I did quit. It wasn't until 2008 when I literally just felt like I had enough thoughts in my head that I needed to work through that I turned to the blog and started writing. Originally it was called the Planner Blog, and it was literally a piece that I was writing for myself, the people that I worked with, some close professional friends of mine, and it was a way I had committed myself. You know how when you tell people you're going on a diet and you're going to, lose 20 pounds, and then every day you see these people that post on Facebook like, oh, I've lost a pound, I've lost 2 pounds. It's like this self-reaffirming process. I told everybody I'm going to write this blog, and I'm going to write 3 days a week. And in a sense, it was my commitment to myself that I was going to work until I had developed through these thoughts. And I really thought I would be doing this for 6 months or 9 months. After a period of time, I had a body of work. I had coined the phrase strong towns. I had come up with what I thought were measurable metrics, principles, concepts that could be applied. And one of my friends called me up and said, you need to do something more with this. I will help you start a nonprofit organization. And we started that in 2009. We submitted the paperwork. We didn't get our 501c3 status until the following December. But at that point, we had been operating as Strong Towns blog for a year. I write 3 days a week. I write a longer piece on Monday that is syndicated in many different areas, including the Better Cities site, amongst others. I write kind of a follow-up piece to that on Wednesday, and then on Friday I do a news digest where I go through the news that I find interesting and give a little brief about each. I think maybe what might be of interest to people here in terms of my writing process is because I publish Monday morning, I do all my writing Sunday night. And that means that I spend Friday night all day Saturday and all day Sunday, making my family miserable because I'm mulling over in my head something that needs to come out in print on Monday morning. And I usually start Sunday night, put the piece together, publish it Monday morning, and then have regrets like immediately. So I wake up, it's the thing that gets me up early on Monday. I like jump out of bed, run over to the computer, call it up, and read it and do like a last edit. Wednesday I typically do like my follow-up piece to that. Okay, here's the stuff that I wished I had said. And so it's kind of a way to, people ask me, how do you write so much? That's the cycle that I use to fill out a week. We've been doing this now for 3 years. I added the podcast 2 years ago, which is kind of another outlet. And, obviously there's a lot of people now reading it. It used to be just like my wife and a couple of friends, and we're getting, 12,000 unique hits a month, unique URLs that are logging on, which is astounding to me because it's just a blog.
But the interesting thing, when we had our conversation before this with Peter, and Peter Katz asked you, Chuck, so what's the business model? And I think the discussion went around to, I'm writing because I have something to say, and that's where you guys started from.
Yeah.
But now, CNU Florida has had you come down to speak. You're doing some speaking. Is it turning into kind of a business idea, or is it something else?
Yeah, I'm being pushed and pulled into that. I started with this, body of work and doing this work in these small towns in central Minnesota, and started this blog, not as a grand business strategy, but as it's evolved. Yeah, the last 2 months, I've been in Harrisburg, D.C., Memphis, 7 stops in California. My friend Howard over there was one of them, in San Diego. Been literally all over the country. And it started out as, okay, I'll come and do this talk if we can pass around the hat for some gas money. And now it is at the point where, I'm being asked to keynote conferences and speak, and there's some fees that have allowed me to, at least the last 2 months and for the next few, to make it a full-time job. I'm actually pulling a full-time salary now from the nonprofit organization, where a year ago it was all just passion. So that's been fulfilling. There's more coming, and we're getting to that, but I don't know how it will manifest itself, but there are so many people asking for more that we really need to create a framework to do it.
Phil, how about tell us a little about the transition and evolution of New Urban News to become and to have the web presence with Better Cities and Towns?
Well, I think we were probably later than some in going on the web, I guess I wasn't that enthusiastic about it. Rob Studeville, my editor and publisher, was the one who felt that this is what we needed to do, and actually I think it's turned out really nicely in terms of being able to do stuff really quickly and get much more response. I mean, I came out of the traditional newspaper business and magazines where you write something and then maybe there's a couple letters to the editor, or maybe there's some personal letters in response, and so it's really interesting to be able to put stuff out there and have people take off on it as a discussion. And it takes a lot of, it's taken some adjustment for me to the idea that, the readers are going to correct you and you'll have this discussion about, what things mean. Now we've been on the web since, I think it's probably around August. This August it'll be about 2 years. And we first wanted to distinguish it from the print newsletter by calling it New Urban Network, which I thought was a very good name. But also, we've been going through a period where print publications are having a lot of trouble. Newspapers, magazines, and basically we came to the conclusion that we needed to broaden our audience to include more people from the smart growth field. I mean, we're covering new urbanism, which is a part of smart growth. Certainly the two movements are very closely related. And, but the term new urban news, I don't think necessarily reached all of the people that we wanted to reach. And so we thought it would be better to try to expand our audience and make sure that people involved in the smart growth movement knew what we were doing and would tend to look us up, and to reach more public officials. So we changed the name of the newsletter at the end of last December, and some people have said, well, we don't really like that name, but I think it fits very well. And seems to be pretty well accepted. And so,
well, it's, I mean, what's interesting compared to the New Urban News newsletter is in our books, you don't have a little cart you can click on or a little shop area. So there's obviously a business model to this as well. There's an interactive component to it for folks like us at the university to promote, say, an academic program or something. If I decide today that I'd like to advertise, I can do it today with your website. Whereas if you want to do through a print medium, there's the real-time aspect that Chuck was bringing in about print and discussion and writing online, as well as the interactive part. People can comment on what you've written, and you have a whole dialogue, as opposed to the book and the newsletter and the magazine that's a static piece that's out there. Jim, you also have a web presence. Tell us how that started and what you use that for.
It just seemed, the book business was changing so drastically and so quickly that it just seemed like a good idea to have some presence on the internet as a platform for building an audience. So I decided to write a blog, and as it evolved, I decided some things about it. I decided that it would be best to have a very short form, that it should be punchy, that it should try to get to people through the right lobe of their brain rather than the left lobe of their brain. So I put more effort into constructing metaphors than I did into, presenting logical arguments. And I decided to do it every Monday without fail, so that people could expect to get a few laughs on Monday morning. But unlike Chuck, I wrote it on Monday morning. So I had to get up very early and try to be funny very early in the morning. But that was about it. And it evolved a little further. I met a young man about half my age who knew more about the internet than I did, and he sort of engineered me into a weekly podcast, which has worked out pretty well. We have a pretty good audience. And so that's become part of the platform package. And I think that it does help selling books, although I would add that the book publishing business has only gotten more chaotic in the last 5 years, and nobody knows, nobody in the business knows where it's going. They're all terrified, and it's a pretty scary situation for all involved, including the authors.
Okay, we'll do a couple of quick questions, and then Peter's going to show us a few slides on books that he was thinking of writing, and then we'll still have time for some questions. But I wanted to ask, especially the print writers, do you work with an editor, and what's your experience with that? Good, just quick responses.
Well, for the newsletter, Rob Studeville reads everything that I write and edits that. Fortunately, he edits me very lightly, so I like it.
And how about on your books?
And on the books, my experience is that you spend a little bit of time getting the attention of the editor at the publishing house, who sort of says, well, you should go in that direction and not in that direction. and who does a little bit of attention to style or language, and then you're on your own. And then, so you write the entire manuscript, and then you give it to the publisher, and then the editor hands it off to the copy editor, and suddenly the copy editor raises all sorts of questions, but usually those questions are more to do with little minute things rather than the big ideas. So I think that there isn't a whole lot of editing that goes on in book publishing these days. I think that once you get your idea accepted and have your initial meetings with your editor, you have a lot of leeway.
Jim?
I've always regarded editors as a form of vermin to be avoided as much as possible. So the more indisposed, negligent, and alcoholic they were, the better it was for me. Because I don't like them putting their paws on my prose, because they always ruin it and make it worse. And I've been very fortunate in recent years because my books have been almost not edited at all. I don't know, maybe it shows. But it's gotten to the point now where, and in fact, in the last couple of go-arounds with Simon & Schuster, which was my previous publisher, my editor didn't even read my books. I discovered after the fact. He never even read them. So that was kind of interesting. So that's how I feel about editing. It's not, I didn't have, maybe it would have been nice to have that old Maxwell-Perkins relationship, but I just didn't have it. I also had a rather narcissistic mother. Poor me. I'll have a pity party.
My experience, primarily on the placemaking book, because that was the first book I did all on my own. ULI assigns a copy editor to you. I had a great copy editor who, it was kind of a process where I would send in sections of the book, and she didn't really know the topic and certainly didn't know kind of the new urbanist twist to things. So she would question me a lot on, what do you mean by this? What is this transect thing? And so there was more of a dialogue going back and forth. But then there were also, I think, 4 or 5 outside readers who were anonymous. And I would get all of their feedback. And the good thing was, as this took place, I could see it all happening in track changes in Word. You could see all the different things happening. And then I would reach a point where I'd read through my chapter and I'd realize it did not look like anything I would have written. And so then you could just take all of the stuff that people had put in out and go back to what the original voice was. And I think that's really important, not to allow the editing process to take your voice out of it, because that's the essential thing you're trying to bring to it. It's not just a factual guide to new urbanism or whatever your topic is. You're bringing your own perspective, and you shouldn't allow anybody to take that out in the process. Peter?
I'm glad you raised the question of the editor, because in a lot of ways they are the gatekeepers on what the American public at least used to see in books. No longer. The Internet's changed that. But it was a curious phenomenon. I wouldn't go so far as to call them vermin, as Jim did, but they do have certain qualities. They tend to live in New York and work in New York, which, when you're dealing with the subject of urbanism, is not the world. And it's this curious phenomenon where the goldfish doesn't know it's in water. New York is one of the most amazing urban places on earth, but the people who inhabit New York don't necessarily know how it got that way and how to keep it that way. So they take for granted. So again, the profile of the typical editor, it's a bright woman who may have come there in her early 20s. She's still working there in her late 50s, early 60s. She might be rather angry about the world for this and that. We don't know what.
Being underpaid.
But for her, the issue of suburban design is not an issue. And so there were dozens of these people who passed on my book. The fellow who finally got excited about it, Joel Stein, who was a young, thoughtful guy living in the village through his 20s and 30s, got married, had children, could no longer afford to live in Greenwich Village, moved out to suburban New Jersey, and was utterly horrified by what his options were. And along came my book. And he thought, hallelujah, there's hope. Maybe my family and I could actually live in one of these places one day. So the real substantive conversation between Joel and myself is, where do I find one of these places? Forget your book. Help me. I'm desperate. because we missed the village terribly. We missed city life terribly, and now I'm living in suburban hell. And so that's really what we bonded over. And at that point, Joel said, you know, this isn't the kind of thing we do, but by gosh, this book needs to happen. So it was really a personal hook. And I have to tell you, with journalists all over the country, in terms of publicizing the book, that was the common denominator. They were desperately trying to put their lives together and had no clue how to do it. And it was about the subject matter. It was no longer a story to them. It was their lives. And I guess I did want to come back to one point I mentioned before. I talked about my book being a propaganda piece. What I neglected to mention is it was an issue that I felt very passionate about. I wasn't an urban designer at the time, but I felt that through communication, that was my opportunity to add to the movement. And I know Rob Studeville, who's here, who's the publisher of New Urban News and now Better Towns and Cities, it was kind of the same thing. It's like Andres Duany talks about this like a guerrilla war where there's no central command. We all figure out what our jobs are. That's kind of been the way this movement has worked. You know, I don't know whether that's what you were thinking in rural Minnesota, but it's kind of like, okay, I know what I know how to do. I know what needs to happen here. I'm just going to get on with the business of doing it. So we did.
And one other comment on, if you do have outside readers or if you do have a very active copy editor, it sets up some great arguments. I remember, and it was very odd having an argument with an anonymous reader out there who was sending these comments, and there were some very specific things that, well, one was I was using the term new urbanism too much, but then there were some quotes like someone said that the town centers weren't just about making money or weren't just about shopping, they were also about congregating. And some retail expert objected strenuously to that statement and wanted it out. And we went back and forth, and finally I said, this is a freaking quote. You know, I'm quoting someone who said that, who, by the way, is a retail developer and respected in your field. And so, I mean, it sets up these arguments, and that's a really interesting process. But remember, it's your name on the book, and, you know, it has to reflect your thoughts and your ideas, and not just cave into what someone on the outside says. So, Peter, you're going to tell us a little bit about books I was thinking of writing for a few minutes, and then we'll take some questions.
And by the way, before I forget, I've never said this to his face, I've never said it publicly, but I do need to mention, in the world of writers and journalists, there's this concept of a scoop. Who gets the story first? Phil Langdon got the story first. That Atlantic piece, that cover story, which I saw on my friend Adam Gross's dresser, Air St. Gross in Baltimore, and different people were carrying around dog-eared copies of the story for years because Philip saw it and called it first. What year was that?
It was March of 1988.
88, way back, like the dinosaurs roaming the earth. Everybody at that time was worshiping Michael Graves and Richard Meyer and the Pomo crowd.
When was the progressive architecture issue on New Urbanism?
Well, what they called New Urbanism.
I don't know.
Okay.
But I mean, this is way back when. So we, you know, and by the way, because he'd written it, I figured, I'm not going to do it's all over with. You know, the story's been told. And in fact, the story's been told, and Jim added his layer of profanity to the subject and kind of helped put a little bile into it.
So. The reason. It's the same reason that Achilles dragged Hector around the city of Troy 3 times. You know why? Because he was just that pissed.
So over the years, as I said to you before, you only write a book, A, when you've got something to say, and B, when you've got a business plan that's going to make that ridiculous amount of effort worthwhile. So over the years, I get these ideas to do books. Being a graphic designer, the first thing I do is I design the cover, and I write the contents, and I put it on the shelf, and then 6 months later, I get another idea and another idea. I'm working up my courage to actually do another book. It doesn't bother me to show these to a room full of people because I don't care if you steal the idea, because if you do, you've got to go through the hard work of writing it. The hard part is not the idea, it's the writing it. And in fact, Dan Parolik, I was going to do a book on form-based codes, and then one day I said, why am I going to do that? I don't want to write codes for a living. Why would I go through that brain damage to be an expert about something that I can't make money on? So Dan wrote the book, and hallelujah. So I thought a manual, Building the American Neighborhood. I stole a picture from Dover Cole here. I thought that would be useful, a good thing to have. But again, it's very useful. I hope somebody does it. I can't figure out how I'm going to make money off that. It might be a textbook. You do make money on textbooks, by the way. To the person who finally writes the new Urbanist textbook, they'll make money. Here's one of many books just about the general problem. Again, I think Jim Kunstler did a better job of this than I ever could have. Growing Pains, you'll notice the pattern of the street is like a big question mark there. How America is losing the war against sprawl and what can be done about it. Okay, other people have done that. This is one I want to do. At the end of the day, don't tell anyone, but I'm not a big fan of subsidized housing for the poor. I don't think we should hand out Jeep Cherokees to people who can't afford cars either. But a friend of mine, Charles Buki, who is very much in the affordable housing industry, makes some very eloquent arguments about issues relating to that industry. And I keep trying to poke Charles to say, why don't you write that book? And he says, well, if I do, I'll never eat lunch in this town again, this town being Washington, D.C. So this is a book that I had kind of hoped to provoke him into writing, and I would, of course, go along for the ride. Probably the Heritage Foundation would love to subsidize this because they've been trying to shut down HUD for years. Again, I don't want to suggest that it's all that confrontational. Charles has some very good prescriptions on how to fix things. There's a lot of very counterintuitive aspects of cities. There are things like why when you add more roads, traffic increases. There's a lot of just curious aspects of physics and such that I think would be very, very interesting to have in a book, particularly for those NIMBYs who can't understand how if the last 10,000 people completely destroyed the region, how the next 10,000 that planners are proposing should move there will actually help it heal. But I thought that would be a useful book, understanding the counterintuitive aspects of urban development. Here's another title for the same book, The Counterintuitive City. As a graphic designer, that hyphen bugs the daylights out of me. But counterintuitive is a really long word, and I don't know how you'd fit it on a cover otherwise. So understanding why older places work so well and why the suburbs fail under the stress of new development. I get into very long subtitles. This is one that would be more academic. I had a chance to actually lead a team doing the regional plan for the Charleston area. It was going to be the largest regional plan in the country. And it suddenly dawned on me that the real genius of Joe Riley was the client. And he really wanted us to look at placemaking at the regional scale. And so the idea was, instead of just counting car trips, we were going to really get into understanding the DNA of the Charleston region. And had this idea that if you think on multiple scales at once, the region, the neighborhood, and even down to the building and the block, which is the real genius of new urbanism, that maybe the secrets of regional planning could be unlocked that way. So this was an idea of doing a book where you looked at the largest scale. You really looked at design at a series of scales. These are a series of amazing charts by Seth Harry to kind of understand how you program the region in terms of what kinds of stores go into what scale. And really, for me, I was just cutting and pasting a lot of beautiful images that I'd stolen from other people, but thought it would make a great coffee table book. And by the way, Chapter 1 of the Fort Myers Comp Plan has one of the most amazing discussions of what to do with old malls, and that's where I stole those images from. And then finally, this is one of the more cosmic ones. If you talk to people like Stuart Brand, who wrote the Whole Earth Catalog, about what's going on in these mega cities of Asia, where we were once predicting global apocalypse, he's actually showing that when people move from the farms to the cities, that it stabilizes population, that urbanization is really the best form of birth control that's ever been invented. And so really this idea that as people move to cities, global populations will stabilize. Transit systems mean that we'll be able to actually inhabit these places more efficiently. So this one gets a little cosmic. And then finally, the one that I probably will write, and I was going to probably try to rope Chuck Marohn into this and a few other people, is really just looking at the subtitle, it's Place Rules, Why We Need a Complete Overhaul of Our Development Regulations and Tax Policies to Create, Renew, and Rebuild America's Communities. And Michael Pagano, who's going to be speaking here tomorrow, has an amazing set of maps of the region, how the region changes its form based on whether you have sales tax or property tax and whatnot, but really a kind of a diagnostic on the rules. I actually came up with this before Emily Talent did her book, City Rules. But so I may well go ahead and do this to try to take a very complex subject and dumb it down to a level where most Americans can understand it. So And I don't have enough business cards to hand out to everyone, but just in case anyone wants to contact me.
All right, great. Thank you. And now we've got a few minutes left, and there are microphones in the aisles. And I'm actually going to call out one person out of the audience who I think I see back here behind the gleaming spots. Is that Tom Dolan over there? Tom? Would you be so kind as to come up to the microphone? Tom is a brand new author. His book arrived in my mailbox just last week. And just tell us a little bit about your journey. And yeah, actually, tell us the title of the book first, and then tell us a little bit about your journey and any advice you'd have for somebody who might want to write a book on something they really care about.
The book is Live, Work, Planning, and Design, subtitled Zero Commute Housing. And it's the book. I could have written the book 10 years ago. It would have been a slightly different book, but it incorporates ideas that really were developed by me when I discovered this new building type, the Live, Work, Courtyard community in the mid-1980s, not long after Seaside. My experience, I actually knew that I wanted to do the book a number of years ago, as I said, and I applied for a night fellowship and did not get it, but at the time, I don't know if it was you, Chuck, or I guess it was Liz, said, okay, we're not going to give you the fellowship, but we're going to try to find you a way to do this book. So we're going to give you Andrea Gullin to work with, and she did work with me on my book proposal for a long time, and helped me try to find a publisher. I went to Wiley eventually, and did in fact get an offer of a book contract. I knew nothing about the law of book contracts. I had no idea. I know something about real estate law. I know something about business contract law, but I knew nothing about whether having the rights to all forms of the book now in existence and ever to be invented in the future was whether I was being taken to the cleaners or whether it was actually just normal. And so I actually hired an agent who gets 15% of everything, not to procure the book for me, procure the editor, the publisher, but to actually just help me negotiate the contract. So as far as my experience with Wiley, they produced a nice book. They did virtually nothing in terms of, they did no editing. I actually had to hire a content editor. They were good to work with in a lot of ways, but they did nothing. And my understanding is they don't do a whole lot to market the book either.
But this book,
they did design it, and it came out well. I'm happy with that.
This was a book, and talk about being passionate and really committed to an idea. This is a book probably, 8 years or more in the making?
In a way, although really it took about 2 years to write it and edit it.
But then, of course, life intervenes when we set out to do these things. So there's a lot of other things that happen. That was a really good point, though, in terms of it's your intellectual property, and it's not just a book anymore. So like when I did the placemaking book, there were 300 odd images in the book, and 80% of those images were mine. They were images that I took, and I had no idea until it was almost going to be published whether I in fact still owned those images or not. So I had to look very carefully at what I had agreed to and what the contract said. And then later on, I remember a few years later at one of the ULI conferences, somebody came up and said, "Oh yeah, we just got a contract to publish the book in Chinese and Spanish." I'm like, "Oh, that's good." I had to go back and see if did I sign away those rights too, because I had no idea that all of these different avenues would exist. And now you can even buy it in electronic form. You can get it as a PDF, delivered to your device. But I signed not for royalties. I got paid up front, and that was another discussion I had with the authors. It varies a lot in terms of whether you'd want to do that or not. With ULI, that was a very smart thing to do, and the advice was, it could take you forever to make any money on royalties, and if the book doesn't do that great, you may never really get much of anything. I got paid very well up front, and so I'm very happy with that arrangement. But what you control is very, very smart to have somebody look carefully at that contract before you sign it.
I should mention one other thing. Actually, I gave a talk in 2001 to the Council on the New Urbanism, and Andre Strani saw the talk and was very excited and said, have you done a book about this? And I said, no. He said, you got to do one. You got to do one. Whatever you want, I'll help you do it. And in between, I had 2 kids, and that's why it took so long. But he really was a strong impetus in terms of helping me to do, or of leading me to actually get the book done.
Thanks for being a good sport. Let me call you out, and everybody go check out Tom's book. I want to take at least 1 or 2 more questions. Is there somebody over here?
I'd like to first start by thanking Mr. Kunstler, because it was the horrific, nightmarish visions that you gave me of the world that sort of got me into New Urbanism in the first place. I didn't know I was supposed to laugh at your blog and not like spin. I said I didn't know I was supposed to laugh at your blog. I just cry on Monday mornings. I just read it and weep and think I won't make it through lunch. But I did want to ask, what is the most, I guess, efficient way, as someone who wants to go into advocacy writing, nonfiction writing in this realm, what's the most efficient way to make the sort of contacts that you need, or to find the kind of approach to at least a meager kind of living?
Well, it's really changed. When I started out, the armature of journalism was still in place, and you could work for a large organization, and they were pretty good about providing you with a desk and a phone and a budget for doing stuff. And I learned how to be an investigative reporter by doing it in the 70s, and that's just not true anymore. And frankly, I don't know how people go out and start doing that kind of thing. In fact, it's probably a crisis of journalism, and it's one of the reasons why we are not able to construct a coherent consensus about what's happening to us in this country anymore, because that journalism is not there anymore. But writing books is different. Writing books is more like making bratwurst. You just have to churn the links out day after day after day. And this is the important thing. This is the really important thing, and it's true about being a writer in general. Get used to the fact that you're working in a vacuum. Don't look for validation from your friends and your loved ones. Don't give them your manuscripts. Don't expect to get approval. The most important thing to know of all is that perseverance counts for more than talent. I've known a lot of writers in the last 35 years who were really good writers, but they just couldn't suck up the disappointment of having their manuscripts rejected or not getting jobs, or one thing or another. It's not so much about talent. It's really about hanging in there.
How about one last question over here? We're a little over, but let's go.
Thanks for you all participating in this panel. You're all prolific writers, and I hope that would mean that you're prolific readers as well. In reading kind of our collective body of work, what is your assessment of architects, designers, engineers, our collective ability to get our reach, refine our subjects? How are we doing as a Congress in reaching the subjects that we need to be?
Liz touched on this a little bit last night in her opening plenary, and we talked about it in our conversation ahead of time, that it used to be for someone to be a new urbanist or to have a discussion with other new urbanists, there were like 3 books. They were like these 3 books and maybe one other one, Towns and Town-Making Principles, and Peter Calthorpe's first book. You read those books or you looked at them. In the case that, like I told Peter, I was one of those people who I read the opening essays and then I looked at the pictures. I looked at the plans. That was the way you kind of absorbed that information, the way you studied it as a planner, as a designer. It's
a good thing my book didn't have pictures in it.
Yeah, I had to read Jim's
We call
book.
them pictures.
But his language is so visual. But then you could, after you read those 2 or 3 books, you were familiar with them, you could show up at a place like this and you could be right up to date and up to speed. Now there is so much published and being published, and especially with the recession, I think there's even more being published. Seems like every new urbanist is working on a book or 2. There's a ton of information out there, and now it's getting very specialized, so a book on live-work units. So I think there's a wealth of knowledge. I think we've lost a little something in terms of, like the early television age where there was only 3 channels and, we all had the same kind of common frame of reference. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. So I'd welcome other comments from the panel.
I'm going to make a self-serving comment. I actually learned the art of propaganda at the knee of Richard Meyer, the great modernist who designs those white buildings. I learned about how to keep organized photo files and how to get things in the hands of a journalist in 4 hours when they're ready to write a story on something. And he's a master of propaganda without a lot of words, just how to communicate. I'm going to make I think if the architects had been left to their own devices, this movement would still be 25 people sitting in a classroom. A lot of the reason why this movement flourished is because people like Jim, like myself, like Phil, rallied to it because we saw something important going on and we lent our efforts to it and we said, these architects don't know how to talk about this stuff, we need to help them. Now, Peter Calthorpe, Andres Duany, Solomon, these are incredibly articulate people. They actually do know how to talk rather well and to write within books. But I think, I look at somebody like Stefanos, and I'll have to say, when I first heard Stefanos in Los Angeles talking about Playa Vista in front of a podium, he was unintelligible. It was architect speak. Stefanos has been challenged by his colleagues to learn to talk so that people can understand it, and he's an incredibly eloquent speaker. I think architects were just in this weird habit of speaking in a very arcane way 15 or 20 years ago. I think it might have been out of insecurity. But I think this really has been a partnership because it's about stuff that normal people can understand. It's not about arcana. It's about real places that real people live in, and it's about time architects step forward and recognize their responsibility to do that. So we helped.
I feel like we are at a pivot point in a sense, or an evolutionary point. And I say this with all respect to the rest of my co-panelists up here, but if you look at the 1980s, 1990s version of publishing a book or getting a book released, to me it's a little bit of analogous to the way that we as new urbanists have done planning for a long time. You get a catchy title, you throw a bunch of pictures together, and then you let the fine grain of the text kind of be the afterthought in a sense. And I do think, I'm looking out here and I'm seeing at least 4 people that I know that blog on a regular basis, out here in the crowd. These are people that I read, as routinely as I can. I think the idea of this movement, the way we write, the way we plan, moving to be more of a bottom-up, fractal type of process where, we're embracing on the one end the tactical urbanism, but then on the other end it's not the mega project, it's something more earthy, more incremental, I think is a good metaphor for not only how we write, but how we should plan and how we should build. I've had 3 agents contact me to put me whatever on, work with me on a proposal to write a book. I'm working on one right now with one of those 3. To me, I feel like if you're a young person wanting to write a book today, you have to develop what you want to say, reach an audience, create some unique body of thought, and then put it out and have it have meaning. I think we often write to ourselves, and if we're going to take that next leap, it needs to be to this much broader audience.
I think that's part of the good news is that anyone in this audience can go home and start a blog. You can start writing today. You can create a presence. And one of my students a month ago launched a website called MiamiUrbanist.com. And I have the T-shirt with me. I thought about wearing it today. But and it's about real estate and placemaking and the urban dweller in Miami. And every time something happens, every time there's an event at the university, every time there's something going on in the news, he's writing about it, and you can find your audience very quickly. You don't have to wait for Simon & Schuster to think you have a good idea. You don't have to wait for anybody. You can decide that this is something I'm passionate about, and I'm going to start reaching out to the world and connecting. Any last thought?
Yeah, it seems to me that in the last 3 years there's just been this proliferation of good books on specific topics within new urbanism. And a lot of them are really excellent. Some of them just get across a lot of information on a particular topic. And some of them cover really a lot of ground, like Retrofitting Suburbia by Ellen Dunham Jones and June Williamson, which I thought just had a lot of interesting information that I hadn't seen. And I think that the recent book, Sustainable Transportation Planning by Jeff Tumlin at Nelson Nygaard, I mean, it's really a remarkable book because he starts out in a very general way, like a lot of us were concerned with, like Jim was years ago, with doing something at a broad scale. I mean, he starts saying, well, what kind of society do we want? And then from that, coming down to, okay, transportation has to be part of that, but he has a sense of what kind of society he's looking for. So it's not dull, it's full of really pretty gripping stuff. So I think there's a lot of good stuff taking place.
So read Phil's reviews, book reviews, so you can find out what the good books to check out are. I want to thank our panel, terrific panel here.